Sometimes the greatest miracle doesn't arrive with applause. Sometimes it knocks on your front door after everyone else has gone to sleep. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Ethan Carter looked up from the old kitchen table where he had been sorting repair receipts beneath the warm glow of a single hanging light. The tiny farmhouse outside Ashford, Montana, had fallen completely silent. His 9-year-old daughter, Lily, had already drifted asleep upstairs after insisting on finishing one more chapter of her favorite library book. Outside, the October wind carried dry leaves across the gravel driveway, and somewhere beyond the pine trees a lonely coyote called into the cold night. Ethan rubbed the grease from his hands with an old shop towel before reaching for his coffee mug, only to realize it had gone cold nearly an hour earlier. It had been another 14-hour day at Carter Auto Repair, another day of fixing aging pickups, replacing worn brake pads, and helping neighbors who often promised to pay him next month. He never complained. The garage barely kept the lights on, but it had given Lily a safe home and a father she could always count on. Then came the sound that didn't belong. Tires rolled slowly across the gravel outside his house. One vehicle became 2, then 3. Bright headlights spilled through the front windows, stretching long shadows across the worn hardwood floor. Ethan frowned. Nobody visited this far outside town at midnight. He quietly stood, careful not to wake Lily, and walked toward the front door. The engines fell silent one after another until the entire property seemed to hold its breath. He opened the door. Parked beside his mailbox was a line of black luxury SUVs, unlike anything usually seen in Ashford. Their polished paint reflected the pale moonlight, while well-dressed drivers remained respectfully beside the vehicles. Standing alone at the end of the short walkway was a woman in an elegant camel coat. Her blonde hair moved gently in the autumn breeze, and although her posture carried unmistakable confidence, her expression revealed something unexpected. She looked relieved. She looked nervous. She looked as though finding this small farmhouse meant more to her than closing the biggest business deal of her life. Ethan recognized neither her face nor the expensive vehicles behind her. He simply offered the same quiet courtesy he gave every stranger. "Can I help you?" he asked. The woman took one careful step forward before stopping beneath the warm porch light. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying the scent of fresh earth and distant wood smoke. Finally, she smiled. Though her eyes shimmered with emotion, she seemed determined to control. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I've been searching for you since this afternoon." Ethan glanced toward the unfamiliar convoy before looking back at the woman. "I'm sorry," he replied politely. "Have we met?" She slowly shook her head. "No," she answered. "But this morning, you saved the most important person in my life." Ethan searched his memory. Dozens of customers had come through his garage that day. A rancher with a cracked radiator, a young couple with a flat tire, an elderly woman driving an old blue Buick whose engine had overheated 20 miles outside town. He had repaired the loose coolant hose, refused her money, and told her to drive home safely. To him, it had been nothing extraordinary. The woman standing before him took another quiet breath before extending her hand. "My name is Victoria Harrington," she said. "I'm here because the elderly woman whose car you fixed is my grandmother." Victoria Harrington lowered her hand slowly after introducing herself, giving Ethan enough time to absorb the words without pressure. He studied her face for a quiet moment, then looked beyond her toward the row of black sport utility vehicles parked along the gravel driveway. Nothing about the scene made sense. The woman standing on his porch carried herself with effortless confidence, yet there was no arrogance in her voice. Instead, there was genuine gratitude. Ethan finally nodded. "Your grandmother was driving an old blue Buick," he said. Victoria smiled immediately. "Yes, she refuses to replace it because my grandfather bought it for her almost 40 years ago." Ethan could not help smiling. "Back," she told me that while I was tightening the coolant hose. Victoria laughed softly, relieved that she had found the right man. "She also told me you refused every dollar she offered." Ethan shrugged, as though it required no explanation. "She needed the money more than I did if she was still trying to keep that car running." Victoria looked at him in disbelief. Mr. Carter, my grandmother could buy every car on the dealership lot tomorrow morning. Ethan raised an eyebrow before quietly answering. That may be true, but I did not know that yesterday, and it would not have changed anything. Those simple words settled over the porch with more weight than any prepared speech. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The cold Montana air drifted between them while dry leaves rolled across the wooden steps. Victoria realized she had spent years listening to presentations about leadership, success, and influence. Yet one mechanic standing in worn work boots had just explained character more clearly than anyone she had ever met. She reached into her coat pocket and carefully removed a cream-colored envelope. I wanted to thank you properly, she said. Please accept this. Ethan did not even look inside. He gently pushed the envelope back toward her. I appreciate the thought, but I cannot take money for doing what I believe was the right thing. Victoria hesitativ. It is not charity. Ethan smiled kindly. I know, but if I accepted payment after refusing it yesterday, then my decision yesterday would no longer mean what it was supposed to mean. She slowly lowered the envelope. Once again, he had answered with calm honesty instead of pride. Before either of them could continue, a small voice floated down the staircase inside the house. Dad! Ethan turned toward the doorway just as Lily appeared wearing warm pajamas and carrying her stuffed rabbit beneath one arm. She blinked sleepily at the unfamiliar visitors before looking up at her father. Is everything okay? Ethan immediately softened. Everything is fine, sweetheart. I am sorry if we woke you. Lily stepped onto the porch beside him and politely smiled at Victoria. Victoria knelt slightly so they could meet at eye level. You must be Lily. The little girl nodded. Yes, ma'am. Victoria smiled warmly. Your father helped my grandmother today. Lily looked proudly at Ethan, as though hearing something she had known all along. He helps people every day, she answered. Sometimes they bring cookies instead of money. Ethan laughed quietly, embarrassed. Victoria laughed with him, and for the first time that evening the distance between billionaire and mechanic seemed to disappear. Standing beneath the warm porch light, surrounded by silence and mountain air, Victoria realized she had not come to reward a good deed. She had come face to face with the kind of life success could never purchase. Victoria remained on the porch longer than she had planned, not because she still had something important to say, but because leaving suddenly felt strangely difficult. She glanced toward the quiet farmhouse, the worn wooden railing, and the small flower pots that Lily had carefully painted by hand during the summer. Everything about the place reflected care rather than wealth. Ethan noticed her eyes wandering and gently asked, Would you like a cup of coffee before you drive back? She hesitated for only a second before smiling. I would like that very much. A few minutes later, they sat around the small kitchen table, while Lily proudly placed 3 mismatched coffee mugs on faded fabric coasters. The room was simple, warm, and filled with the comforting scent of fresh coffee and homemade cinnamon bread. Victoria quietly looked around without saying a word. There were no expensive decorations, no polished marble, no designer furniture. Instead, she saw framed family photographs, shelves filled with library books, and a refrigerator covered with Lily's drawings held in place by old souvenir magnets. Above the doorway hung a weathered photograph of an older man standing beside the same repair garage Ethan owned today. Victoria nodded toward the picture. Your father? Ethan followed her gaze before smiling softly. My grandfather. He started the garage almost 50 years ago. Victoria leaned forward with genuine curiosity. Did he teach you everything? Ethan looked at the old photograph for a long moment before answering. Almost everything that matters. Lily immediately added, Great-grandpa always said a person's name should be worth more than a signed contract. Ethan laughed quietly. He did say that. Victoria studied the photograph again. The older mechanic wore stained work clothes, but his smile carried the same calm confidence she now recognized in Ethan. He sounds like an extraordinary man, she said. Ethan nodded. When I was 12 years old, I accidentally overcharged a customer because I made a mistake on an invoice. Grandpa walked me all the way across town just to return the extra money. He told me, that people forget prices, but they remember honesty for the rest of their lives. Silence settled gently over the kitchen. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows while the old farmhouse creaked with familiar comfort. Victoria wrapped both hands around the warm coffee mug and realized she had spent years studying business strategy while never hearing a lesson more valuable than the one Ethan had just shared. "My grandfather built a company," she said quietly. "Your grandfather built character." Ethan smiled with humble disagreement. "I think both men simply hoped to leave the world a little better than they found it." Those words lingered in the room. Victoria understood that she had entered the house believing she was there to express gratitude. Yet every passing minute, she found herself becoming the student instead of the benefactor. As the clock quietly moved past midnight, she stood and thanked Ethan and Lily for their kindness. Ethan walked her to the front porch without ceremony. Before stepping toward her waiting vehicle, Victoria paused beneath the porch light and looked back one final time. She saw Lily hugging her father goodnight before running upstairs, and Ethan turning off unnecessary lights to save electricity before locking the front door. There was nothing dramatic about the scene, yet something inside Victoria changed forever. Driving away through the sleeping Montana countryside, she could not stop thinking about the old photograph on the wall, the simple kitchen, and the mechanic who believed integrity should never depend upon who happened to be standing in front of him. By the time the lights of the farmhouse disappeared behind the trees, she already knew that tomorrow's board meeting would feel very different from every meeting that had come before. The following morning, the sky above Billings was clear enough to reveal snow resting on the distant mountain peaks as Victoria, Harrington's vehicle, pulled beneath the glass entrance of Harrington Industries headquarters. Employees greeted her with the same respect they showed every day, yet something about her seemed different. She walked through the marble lobby with quiet confidence instead of hurried determination, offering warm smiles to receptionists whose names she had rarely taken time to remember. Inside the executive elevator, she caught her reflection in the polished steel doors and unexpectedly thought about the faded family photograph hanging inside Ethan's farmhouse. By the time the elevator reached the top floor, she realized she had spent years measuring success by quarterly reports while a mechanic in a small Montana town measured success by whether people trusted his name. The boardroom was already filling with directors reviewing financial projections displayed across enormous digital screens. Thick folders rested neatly beside every chair, each containing the recommendation that several aging manufacturing facilities, including the Ashford plant, should be permanently closed to improve operating margins. One senior executive, Richard Coleman, adjusted his glasses before confidently greeting Victoria. "Good morning. I believe today should be a straightforward vote." Victoria acknowledged him politely, but did not answer immediately. She looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows toward the mountains beyond the city skyline, remembering Ethan quietly saying that people remembered honesty long after they forgot prices. The meeting officially began. Charts appeared across the presentation screens. Revenue forecasts, labor expenses, transportation costs, and shareholder expectations filled the room with numbers that seemed perfectly reasonable. Richard confidently stood and concluded his presentation. "Closing Ashford will improve efficiency and strengthen next year's financial performance." Several directors nodded in agreement. The recommendation sounded logical. It sounded responsible. It sounded complete. Yet Victoria could not stop wondering why none of the charts included the people whose lives stood behind every statistic. She slowly closed the financial report in front of her. The quiet click echoed through the boardroom. Every face turned toward her. "Before we vote," she said calmly, "I would like to ask a simple question." The room became completely still. "How many families depend upon the Ashford facility?" A vice president quickly answered, "Approximately 460 direct employees, plus regional suppliers." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "And how many of us have actually visited that community during the past year?" No one spoke. Several executives glanced toward one another before lowering their eyes to the conference table. Richard finally broke the silence. "With respect, Our responsibility is to protect the company. Victoria met his gaze without raising her voice. I agree. But protecting a company also means protecting the values that built it. Richard gently leaned forward. Values do not replace profit. Victoria answered with quiet certainty. No, but without values, profit eventually loses its purpose. Once again, silence settled across the room. There was no anger, no shouting, only the unmistakable feeling that the conversation had shifted onto entirely different ground. Victoria thought about the old blue Buick, the worn garage, Lily proudly saying that her father helped people every day, and the simple kitchen where kindness had required no audience. She realized that one ordinary afternoon had given her a clearer picture of leadership than years inside executive offices. Looking around the table, she folded her hands and spoke with calm conviction. I am postponing today's vote for 48 hours. Before we decide the future of Ashford, I intend to understand what cannot be measured on a spreadsheet. Several directors exchanged surprised looks while Richard remained motionless. Realizing that the meeting he believed would end in minutes had just become the beginning of something none of them had expected. For the next 2 days, Victoria Harrington did something that surprised nearly everyone around her. Instead of asking for another round of financial projections, she left the executive office and traveled to Ashford herself. Early on a crisp Montana morning, she stepped out of a simple sport utility vehicle with only one assistant, choosing to leave the usual convoy behind. The factory stood only a few miles from Carter Auto Repair, and as employees arrived for their shifts, they greeted one another by name, carrying lunch boxes, travel mugs, and the quiet determination that came from honest work. Victoria watched without announcing who she was. She noticed a father helping his teenage son straighten a crooked tie before the young man began his first day as an apprentice. She watched an older woman laugh with co-workers she had known for decades. None of those moments appeared in quarterly reports, yet every one of them represented something worth protecting. Before visiting the plant, Victoria stopped at Ethan's garage without calling ahead. The large service door was already open, and the familiar sound of impact wrenches echoed through the cool morning air. Ethan was replacing brake pads on an aging pickup truck, while patiently explaining to the owner which repairs could safely wait until next month. I would rather earn your trust than sell you something you do not need today, he said with an easy smile. The customer thanked him sincerely before driving away. Victoria waited until the truck disappeared down the road before walking toward him. Ethan looked up, pleasantly surprised. Good morning, he said. I was not expecting another late-night visitor quite so soon. Victoria smiled. This time I came during business hours. Ethan laughed softly and wiped his hands with the same worn shop towel she had seen before. That already makes today less mysterious. She looked around the garage, noticing familiar details she had missed during the previous night. Every tool had its place. Every workbench was clean despite constant use. A handwritten note from Lily hung beside the cash register that read, "Thank you for supporting my dad's garage." Victoria quietly admired the simple message before turning back toward Ethan. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She hesitated for only a moment. If you were responsible for hundreds of families, and keeping their jobs meant accepting smaller profits for a while, what would you do? Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he picked up a worn socket wrench and carefully returned it to its proper place before speaking. "I have never managed a large company," he said honestly, "so I cannot pretend to understand every decision." Victoria nodded, appreciating that he did not rush to offer easy advice. Ethan continued, "But I do know this. When people believe they matter only when business is good, they eventually stop believing the business cares about them at all. Machines can be replaced. Buildings can be rebuilt. Trust is much harder to restore once it is lost." Victoria lowered her eyes as his words settled deeply within her. He had no idea what decision stood before her, yet somehow he had described its heart with remarkable clarity. Ethan smiled gently, unaware of the weight his quiet wisdom carried. "Whatever choice you make," he added, "I hope the people affected could look you in the eye afterward and know you tried to do what was right." As Victoria drove from the garage toward the Ashford plant, The mountains stretched across the horizon beneath a bright autumn sky. The financial reports waiting inside her briefcase suddenly felt lighter than the responsibility resting on her conscience. And for the first time since becoming chief executive officer, she understood that true leadership was measured not only by what a company earned, but also by what it refused to sacrifice. 48 hours passed more quickly than anyone expected. By 9 o'clock on Friday morning, every seat inside the Harrington Industries boardroom was occupied, and the atmosphere felt noticeably different from the meeting 2 days earlier. The financial reports remained neatly arranged across the polished conference table, but this time they were accompanied by photographs Victoria had personally taken during her visit to Ashford. There were images of the factory floor, longtime employees working side by side, families gathering outside local businesses, and the small community that had quietly grown around the manufacturing plant over generations. As the directors settled into silence, Victoria stood at the front of the room without opening the prepared presentation, waiting on the large display behind her. Richard Coleman folded his hands and spoke first. "I assume we are finally ready to complete the vote." Victoria looked around the room before answering. "Yes, but not before we consider everything that is at stake." She placed one photograph in the center of the table. It showed employees leaving the factory at sunset, smiling as they greeted waiting family members in the parking lot. "These are not numbers," she said calmly. "These are the people whose trust built this company long before any of us occupied these chairs." Richard adjusted his glasses and replied respectfully, "No one questions their dedication. Our concern is sustainability." "Victoria Nadif." "So is mine." She pressed a remote, and the screen displayed 2 financial forecasts. The first outlined the immediate savings that would result from closing the Ashford facility. The second proposed a modernization plan that required greater investment today, but projected stronger long-term stability, higher productivity, and improved employee retention over the coming years. Several directors leaned forward with growing interest. Richard examined the figures carefully. "This approach carries more risk during the next fiscal year." Victoria answered without hesitation. "Every meaningful investment does." Another director quietly asked, "Why are you so confident this is the better decision?" Victoria paused for a brief moment before speaking. "Because I spent the past 2 days listening instead of assuming. I visited the factory. I spoke with supervisors, technicians, apprentices, and local business owners. I saw something our reports failed to measure." The room became completely still. "Loyalty," she continued. "Experience. Pride and honest work. Those qualities cannot be replaced as easily as outdated equipment." Richard remained thoughtful before asking one final question. "And what changed your perspective?" Victoria smiled gently, remembering a quiet garage on the edge of town. "A mechanic reminded me that trust is much harder to rebuild once it is lost." She did not mention Ethan's name. She did not describe his farmhouse or his kindness. His lesson belonged to character rather than recognition. Silence settled across the room as each director reflected upon her words. One by one, they slowly closed the reports recommending closure and began reviewing the modernization proposal instead. The discussion that followed remained respectful, detailed, and focused on solutions rather than fear. Engineers proposed equipment upgrades. Financial officers identified responsible funding strategies. Operations managers suggested phased improvements that would protect production while modernizing the facility. Nearly an hour later, Victoria looked around the table and quietly asked, "Are we ready to vote?" Hands rose one after another in support of the new plan. Even Richard slowly raised his own. He met Victoria's eyes with a small, sincere smile. Perhaps protecting a company and protecting its values were never separate decisions after all. Victoria returned the smile with quiet gratitude. Hundreds of families across Ashford had no idea that their future had just changed inside a silent boardroom. And Ethan Carter remained in his small garage, completely unaware that the simple kindness he had shown a stranger beside an old blue Buick had become the quiet spark that transformed an entire company's definition of success. 3 weeks later, the first signs of change quietly appeared across Ashford. Construction crews arrived before sunrise. Engineers inspected aging production equipment, and new delivery trucks rolled through the factory gates carrying modern machinery that many employees had believed they would never see. There were no television cameras waiting outside, no speeches celebrating the decision, and no headlines announcing what had happened inside the boardroom. Life simply continued, only now it carried a renewed sense of hope. Families who had spent sleepless nights worrying about their future finally allowed themselves to breathe again. Local diners filled with workers ordering breakfast before early shifts. The hardware store welcomed more customers. The small grocery on Main Street stayed open later because business had begun to recover. Quietly, almost invisibly, one decision had begun restoring confidence throughout the entire community. Ethan Carter knew nothing about the boardroom discussion that had made it possible. His mornings still began before daylight as he unlocked the garage, switched on the lights, and organized the tools exactly as his grandfather had taught him decades earlier. Lily continued completing homework at the small desk beside the office, while occasionally greeting customers with cheerful smiles that brightened even the longest repair days. One Saturday afternoon, an elderly rancher arrived with an old pickup whose starter motor had failed. After inspecting the truck, Ethan discovered that replacing one inexpensive part would solve the problem instead of installing an entirely new assembly. The grateful customer looked surprised. "Most shops would have charged me for a complete replacement," he admitted. Ethan simply smiled. "You only replace what actually needs replacing." The rancher shook his hand before driving away, promising to recommend the garage to everyone he knew. Lily watched through the office window and quietly asked, "Dad, do you ever wonder if being honest makes life harder?" Ethan paused while placing a wrench back onto its rack. He looked toward the old photograph of his grandfather hanging above the workbench before answering. "Sometimes it does," he admitted honestly. "But honesty lets you sleep peacefully at night, and that is worth more than anything money can buy." Lily smiled, satisfied with the answer, and returned to coloring another drawing for the waiting room wall. Across town, Victoria Harrington received weekly progress reports showing construction milestones, employee retention, and production improvements exceeding expectations. The modernization plan required patience, but every update confirmed that the decision had been the right one. During one executive meeting, Richard Coleman quietly approached her after everyone else had left the room. "I want to tell you something," he said. Victoria looked up from her notes. Richard offered a thoughtful smile. "I believed leadership meant always choosing the safest financial path. I think I forgot that people choose where to give their best work based on trust, not only salaries." Victoria nadi de priscetibli. "We all keep learning." Richard glanced toward the window, overlooking the city before speaking again. "Have you thanked the mechanic who inspired all of this?" Victoria smiled softly. "Not yet." Richard seemed surprised. "Why not?" She looked toward the distant mountains beyond the skyline and answered with quiet certainty. "Because he never helped my grandmother, hoping something would come back to him. When I thank him again, I want it to be as one grateful person to another, not as a chief executive rewarding an employee who never worked for me." That evening, as the sun settled behind the Montana hills, Victoria folded a small handwritten note and placed it inside her coat pocket. She decided that the following weekend she would return to the little farmhouse outside Ashford, not carrying contracts, envelopes, or business proposals, but bringing only her grandmother, sincere gratitude, and the respect that one quiet act of kindness had earned without ever asking to be noticed. The following Saturday morning arrived with the kind of clear Montana sky that made the mountains appear close enough to touch. Carter Auto Repair was already busy before 8 o'clock as neighbors stopped by for oil changes, tire repairs, and routine maintenance. Ethan Carter moved from one vehicle to the next with the same steady patience that had become the rhythm of his life. He never hurried a conversation, never treated anyone as though their problem was too small, and never noticed that the lessons he quietly lived each day had already traveled much farther than he ever imagined. Around mid-morning, Lily looked through the front office window and smiled. "Dad," she called, "I think your friends are here." Ethan stepped outside, wiping his hands with the familiar shop towel, and immediately recognized the restored blue Buick rolling slowly into the gravel parking lot. The elderly woman climbed out first, her bright smile unchanged from the afternoon he had repaired her car beside the highway. Victoria followed a moment later, dressed simply in blue jeans, comfortable boots, and a light sweater instead of an executive business suit. Without the formal clothing and busy schedule of corporate life, she looked less like the leader of a major company and more like someone grateful to spend a quiet morning among good people. "It is wonderful to see both of you again," Ethan said warmly. The elderly woman laughed. "And this time my car made it here without any trouble." Ethan smiled. "That makes me happier than you know." Lily ran over to greet them with genuine excitement. And within minutes the four of them were sitting together on a pair of old wooden benches outside the garage, while fresh coffee and homemade muffins rested on a small folding table. The conversation drifted naturally from family stories to favorite fishing spots, local weather, and memories of growing up in small Montana towns. Not once did Victoria mention board meetings, financial reports, or the company whose future had quietly changed because of one conversation inside this very community. She had come for something much more important. After a comfortable silence, she reached into her coat pocket and carefully unfolded a handwritten note. "I brought this for you," she said softly. Ethan accepted the paper with quiet curiosity. It contained only a few simple sentences written in careful handwriting. "Thank you for reminding me that leadership begins with character, that kindness never becomes smaller by being unnoticed, and that the greatest success is earning the trust of people who owe you nothing." Ethan read the note slowly before looking back at Victoria with a gentle smile. "These words mean more to me than you probably realize." Victoria shook her head. "They mean more to me than you realize." The elderly woman reached over and gently touched her granddaughter's hand. "Your grandfather used to say that life has a way of introducing us to exactly the people we need, usually when we are not looking." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Mine believed something very similar. The morning sunlight settled across the garage as customers continued arriving one after another. A young couple waved from the parking lot, waiting patiently for Ethan to inspect their family sedan. He stood, folded Victoria's note carefully, and slipped it into the pocket of his flannel shirt. "Duty calls," he said with an easy smile. Victoria watched him walk toward the waiting customers without expecting applause, recognition, or reward. In that quiet moment, she understood that the greatest measure of a remarkable person was not how differently they behaved after changing someone's life, but how faithfully they continued living exactly the same way the very next day. Several months passed, and winter quietly surrendered to the first gentle signs of spring across the Montana countryside. Snow slowly disappeared from the mountain slopes. Rivers carried fresh water through the valleys, and the small town of Ashford settled into a season filled with renewed optimism. The modernization of the manufacturing plant continued ahead of schedule. Local businesses welcomed steady customers once again, and families who had once feared uncertain futures now spoke confidently about college plans, home renovations, and brighter tomorrows. Yet inside Carter Auto Repair, very little had changed. Ethan Carter still unlocked the garage before sunrise each morning, switched on the lights, organized every wrench exactly where his grandfather had taught him, and greeted each customer with the same patient smile that had never depended on recognition. Lily had grown a little taller, but she still completed her homework at the small wooden desk beside the office while decorating the waiting room with cheerful drawings that made strangers feel at home. One cool Saturday morning, Ethan carried a carefully crafted wooden plaque toward the front entrance of the garage. He climbed a short ladder and secured it above the large service door with steady hands. The words carved into the polished wood were simple: "Integrity keeps the engine running." Lily stepped back, admired the sign, and smiled proudly. Great-grandpa would have loved that. Ethan looked at the old building for a quiet moment before nodding. "I hope I have honored what he started." At that very moment, another familiar vehicle rolled gently into the parking lot. The restored blue Buick stopped beside the garage, and Victoria Harrington stepped out together with her grandmother. Neither of them wore formal clothing. They had not come representing a corporation or carrying important announcements. They had simply come to visit friends. Victoria looked up at the new wooden plaque, and her eyes filled with quiet appreciation. "That might be the finest mission statement I have ever read," she said softly. Ethan laughed. "It is easier to remember than most company manuals." They all shared an easy smile before standing together beneath the morning sunlight. No photographers appeared. No reporters arrived. No ceremony interrupted the peaceful moment. The greatest changes had happened quietly, exactly as they often do in real life. Victoria turned toward Ethan with sincere gratitude shining in her eyes. "There is something I have wanted to tell you for a long time," she said. "The decision to protect the Ashford plant has already created opportunities for hundreds of families, and every time I visit there, I remember the conversation we had inside your garage." Ethan gently shook his head. "Those families earned that future through years of honest work. If I reminded you of something important, then I am grateful, but the decision was still yours." Victoria smiled because that answer was exactly what she expected from him. Even now, he refused to take credit for something larger than himself. Her grandmother quietly slipped her arm through Victoria's and whispered, "Some people become wealthy by building companies. Others become rich by building trust. The second kind is much harder to find." Ethan heard the words and simply lowered his head with humble gratitude before turning toward the sound of another truck pulling into the driveway. A customer climbed out and waved apologetically. "Sorry to bother you on a Saturday, Ethan. My brakes started making a strange noise." Ethan smiled as naturally as he had on every ordinary morning before his life unexpectedly crossed paths with Victoria's. "You are never a bother," he replied. "Let's take a look." He rolled up his sleeves, reached for his tools, and walked back into the garage without hesitation. Victoria remained outside for a moment, watching the man who had unknowingly transformed not only the future of a company, but also the heart of the person entrusted to lead it. The mountain stood quietly beyond the garage. The spring breeze carried the scent of fresh pine through the open service door, and the sound of honest work filled the morning air once again. In the end, no fortune, no title, and no public recognition proved more powerful than one ordinary man choosing kindness when no one was watching, because quiet dignity never asks the world to notice it, yet somehow it changes the world all the same.